Okay, the intent of the budget process, it was really to refocus and look at it from a citizen's perspective. We did ask the departments to give a service view of what we do rather than a managerial view. And this will probably take, this is a paradigm shift for a lot of departments. But this is also a very common way of presenting budget material to the public. If you really want the public to engage, then we need to speak their language and present things in a manner that they can understand. So that was what we attempted to do, and I think for our first year, the departments did very well. But understand as we go through the process, you may still see a lot of managerial organization structures. So how did we started this with a financial gap. This was the story that we started with, and it continues to be our story. This is what we came out with. The revenues were projected to grow at 2.3 and expenditures projected to grow at 3.4%. So 2018 needed to be a year to reset, in essence. Specifically for 2018, what the challenges we faced as we started this is we assumed no shift in capacity from the road levy. Certainly any capacity that gets shifted is one-time money, and it needs to be annually reviewed and approved. With that, that meant a loss of $5 million in revenues. But there were also many other things that were affecting our 2018 budget. We did have labor contract increases. We even had step increases, 2.56 for every step increase. And then mandated increases. Our retirement rate increases came out, and minimum wage increases. And then there was mental dental rate increases, postal increases, and several other inflationary increases that affect many of our departments and our services. When we looked at that, initially we were looking at about a $4.4 million increase in cost. That resulted in about a $9.4 million funding gap for 2018. So, starting with those challenges, we established some goals. Wanted to structurally align our resources with our expenditures. What you're going to hear throughout these workshop days is right now what you have is structurally balanced. But some of these cuts, proposed cuts, do have some significant service impacts because they are sudden. It may prompt you to use other funding sources, which means we will be structurally misaligned. But the most important thing is that we've made great progress. Regardless of what your decisions are, we've made great progress in addressing that structural gap. We also wanted to ensure that our employees are supported in the budget. So when we look at those personnel costs, we wanted to make sure that we were providing adequate medical and dental coverage without impacting them. You will see a proposal for a personnel contingency to address all kinds of employee costs increases that we don't yet know, but we certainly anticipate happening based on historical precedents. And then as we go forward and we hear from you and get your direction, we're going to start to develop strategies to continue to address the gap. Just setting 2018 does not mean that we resolved all the issues. It is a continuous cycle. And as I've heard some of you speak, we will also try to target some legislative changes to address our structural issue. Equipment replacement, there is a long list of equipment items that are extremely aged, and beginning to establish an equipment replacement plan is a great first step, and this budget that is presented for you does include at least an initial first step with an equipment contingency. And we're going to discuss those contingencies later this morning. And that goes in line with increase our discretionary capital investment. Last year there was a $1 million, well, for 2017, a $1 million capital investment. That is less than 1% of the general fund budget to invest in capital replacement. And the list is quite long. What we've suggested in this budget is to at least maintain that, but to any degree that we can begin to increase that and develop a more robust capital replacement plan would also be an extremely positive step forward. And begin to fund new high priority strategic initiatives. In many cases, and you're going to see when you review some of these suggestions, seed money is required to begin to make some of those changes. So one of the other contingencies that we'll talk about is a very small strategic initiative contingency, which is intended to help move the county in the direction that you provide and provide some of that seed money. Any questions, commissioners? So exactly what are we here for today? Again, the service proposals. This is the edge of the whole. We're making a huge assumption that a majority of our services that we provide, more than 90% for sure across all departments, is good and foundational and is going to remain intact. So we're really going to focus on these service proposals and what that does to those services. You're going to hear a general fund summary, and you're going to hear some suggestions of how we're going to go forward and continue to monitor and sustain our progress in rebalancing ourselves. And then you're going to hear a proposal to motivate for change. This change, from my understanding, got started several years ago with a strategic plan, strategic initiatives. We want to continue that momentum. So, focusing on service proposals, we wanted to have the departments present what these proposed cuts to their budget, because that is what it is for them, is a reduction. If we're going to close a $9.4 million gap from the initial 2018 budget, it meant departments were going to have to go in and make some budgetary cuts to their 2018. So they classified them. And we just picked 4 main classifications for these cuts or enhancements. Minimal service impact, and you can see that's green. That is really where the department has classified this as having little or no service impact, or the service impact was unknown. An example of this, and I'm not saying what these examples are real or not real, they're just examples to help guide in the classification. But an example for minimal service impact is if a new phone system were implemented and would eliminate potentially front desk support that answers those phones. A lot of businesses use automated phone calls to help guide simple questions, and it does alleviate manual reception work. Moderate service impact. This is where the service will most likely decrease, maybe even below county established standards. But it might be publicly acceptable given the financial situation. There may be higher priority services that you would not want to cut because there are limited amount of funds to use. So there are going to be some tough choices to make. An example would be that if frontline staff are reduced, and it would affect the wait time for the public. But maybe it affects the wait time only during peak hours. A severe service impact. This is where the department has deemed it to almost cripple their ability to provide that service in some respect. An example here is juvenile services. This is, I will tell you, an actual real proposal to eliminate staffing that supports the juvenile inmate electronic monitoring program. And you're going to hear from Ms. Bush tomorrow, so I'm going to let her talk more about that. And then the last one is if it's an enhancement. So this is where the department said if you didn't cut, but you actually enhanced my budget even further, here's the kind of service level that I would be able to deliver. And you will see there are a few departments that do have a couple asks like that. Any questions on those categorizations? Here's how that breaks down for you. 9.4 million was our gap. The department submitted budgets that brought in about 9 million of cuts. Now, with the budget that you have proposed is actually a balanced budget with about $500,000 of unallocated revenue. So that is really came about because departments cut 9 million, and then we were through good analysis and more current information, we were able to adjust some of our revenues projected to almost $1 million. So the bottom line, we have about $500,000 of unallocated revenue. The breakout on the service proposals, as you can see, about 4.1 million has a minimal service impact. Some of that you have already approved, like for detention services with the marshals. Some of those have already been approved, and that's a majority of that. And then moderate, a little more than $1 million of moderate proposal cuts. Severe, 3.7 million. And then departments, on top of not cutting on the severe and moderate side, have asked with a little more than 2 million of enhancements. As we look at service proposals, this is where I want to just start to demonstrate matching up your funding sources with the decisions that you have to make. 3.7 million is if you reject all of those proposed severe service cuts. If you reject all of the severe service cuts and all of the moderate cuts, but we will go through these one at a time and discuss, you would need 4.8 million in funding. If you were to reject all of the severe, reject all of the moderate, and accept the enhancements, you would need 6.9 million of additional funding. It's assumed that you're not going to reject here, but you most certainly can, that you would not be rejecting any of those that have a minimal service impact. Now, when you look at your funding, you can see, again, there's $500,000 of unallocated revenue in the general fund. That is base funding. So that is funding that can support a continued service. Road levy capacity, we estimated that there is about 5 million in capacity, and we have confirmed that with Public Works crew. That is one-time money. Again, we've kind of addressed that's an annual amount that you'd have to continue. So if you should use that to reject any of these proposals, we would have to continue to strategize of how we're going to maintain that service, how we're going to create other efficiencies to carry that forward into the future. And then in fund balance, and we're going to have a larger fund balance discussion here shortly, we're projecting 2.1 million, or we're assuming at this time we have 2.1 million of fund balance available. Questions, commissioners?
Yep. One, in your analysis, have you projected what the 1% property tax increase would be, or is that already factored into the numbers that you're getting to with the 9.4 shortfall?
Commissioner French, the 1% is already calculated into the proposed budget.
Okay. Then I'm assuming at some point you're going to talk about the budget carry forward in terms of what we've got for revenue over projection for the fund balance for 17 to 18.
We will talk about that when we
Okay.
get to the fund balance discussion. and how much we anticipate for that.
Thank
So some of the options, decision options that you have, again, we're not anticipating that you're going to make any decisions during this workshop period. But you can accept the budgetary cut as it's presented to you, which is what we anticipate for most of those that are classified as a minimal service impact. You could modify what is presented to you. This may be worthy for some of those that are moderate, or maybe some of the enhancements where you choose to modify the amount, or you give additional direction, or you modify even the effective date. So we want to make sure that you understand you have all those choices in front of you. Or you could reject the cut that is proposed. This is what it is, where you probably give the greatest consideration to those that have the severe service impact. And then, of course, when it comes to the enhancement proposals, you can accept, modify, or reject any of those as well. Some of the things that we want to keep in mind as we proceed is there were a lot of budget suggestions that were asked through this process, and we received many of them. We received 87 general governmental ideas or suggestions, and 20 law and justice suggestions and ideas. They came from across the board, and we put them in. They have not been vetted with staff. We just collected them and reported them. All we did initially was segregate them into general or law and justice. But we wanted you to see them. We want you to know the departments were thinking, and we received many of them. I'm going to let John talk a little bit about this, because this really feeds into strategic planning and some of the work that he's been doing. So I'm going to let him talk a little bit about what we look for a process to begin to address these.
So, like you've mentioned, Ms. Wallace, for years you've been very supportive of our continuous improvement activities, and we have gotten a lot of really great ideas from a lot of our departments on these. And one thing that was very clear that you asked of us early in this process was to collect these ideas. In Commissioner Kearns, I'm just looking at some of the ideas that you initially had come up with: IT and tech support, the server room, payroll, AP. Those are also part of this list. But to Ms. Walls' point, we've pulled them together based on these two different categories, but we've got to do a lot more vetting. What we're going to be doing over the next 3 days is taking notes on additional items that are going to come up, and we'll come back to you very soon and how we can tie this in even more to the strategic objectives looking forward into 2018. Our departments, since I've been here for almost 5 years, I've been doing a lot of work. Just looking at our portal, they've come up with, at last count, 528 improvement projects that they've been working on to get us to where we are. So we will be coming back to you with these more condensed, consolidated, and with a plan for your consideration on how we go into 2018 and beyond with a lot of these budget suggestions.
You can see what we've suggested here is, yes, that we do take the appropriate time to vet them, review them, prioritize them, and then come back to you for further guidance. Any questions there, commissioners? Well, we're going way faster than I anticipated, huh? Okay, the general fund summary. Hard to see with that line broken out. You can see what we have here. Revenue expenditures with a deficit or a surplus amount. And what we've provided for you is the 2016 actual amount, and then 2017 adopted, and then 2018 preliminary. So what you have in your 2018 preliminary is after the departments have taken those 9 million in cut proposals. Again, which is why you're here to hear how those cut proposals are going to affect the services. But otherwise, your 2018 does include, for example, in property tax, and we're going to get to that in a little bit, it does have the 1%, it does have the new construction estimate in it. It does not have any assumed shift in the county road capacity, which is also why you see the change in revenue, and there's only the growth of about 1.2 million here. And when we factor in due fees, those are about 400,000 on the 2017 amount, but we'll cover that in a little bit. Expenditures, this may hopefully not be too alarming, but there were some assumed cost increases. Again, those labor, those personnel cost increases did affect, and even with 9 million in cuts, you can see our expenditures are still roughly 1.3 million more than our adopted 2017. I'm going to focus a little bit on general fund revenue and some of the details here. You can see some of the big differences primarily in property tax. Again, this is because of that road levy capacity shift. But if you look at sales tax, our strong economic environment is still producing very well, and this is a conservative estimate based on the latest information that we have, and that is one of the key reasons why we ended with a little bit more of unallocated revenue than we anticipated. But 5.6% anticipated over 2017, so very good there. But that also factors into our charges for services. So that is for a lot of our service contracts, like in the sheriff's office and prosecutory services, where we do charge those other entities, as well as some of our license and fees, etc. 5.3, and then other revenue is really a lot of our miscellaneous revenue, our smaller revenues that can fluctuate from year to year. The one category that went down is the intergovernmental revenue. I just want to remind the Commission this is really part of the cost allocation plan, and it can fluctuate from year to year because it does lag 2 years. Does that make sense? You can't project that based on economic or another basis. Any questions here, Commissioners? If you look at the departments as they go through, you will see some of their details for revenues too. And this should not be too surprising. This chart looks very similar. 59% of our revenue portfolio are taxes. So we are heavily dependent on that, which is part of the reason why we do have that structural balance, and we need to begin to contain those costs, our base costs, to this portfolio size. I'm going to go into expenditures now. We are most likely going to wrap up this morning a little earlier, so I'll just wait and we'll take a longer break then. General fund expenditures. You can see overall that $1.3 million increase. Most of that increase, as you can see, is in those personnel expenses. That is those contract labor agreements. It is the standard step increases, medical, retirement rate increases, unemployment, as well as a personnel contingency, which we're going to go over in a little bit as well. Most of the cuts that were taken from departments were in personnel. They did take 9 million in cuts. We're in personnel, but then you can also see it more visibly here in maintenance and operations. We certainly believe that they cut everywhere that they could and still been able to provide a lot of the services. Equipment and capital, you can see that increase of 1 million, but you can also see how extremely small that amount is. It's just a couple hundred million. That 1 million there is really because of two contingencies, the equipment replacement contingency and a strategic initiative contingency, which again, we're going to have a conversation about very, very shortly. So when we look at the portfolio of personnel and we look at those gross general fund expenditures, this is what it would appear to look. It would look like maybe 60% is personnel, and then a large percent is M&O. But what that somewhat misrepresents that we wanted to adjust for is that in our M&O category, we have two very significant transfers, one to the Information Technology Fund and one to Detention Services. When we adjust for those transfers and say, but how much of those budgets are personnel? And when we factor in, so how much of the general fund transfer is funding personnel in those other two funds, which are significant, it actually looks like this, where 76% of our general fund is really supporting personnel costs, and 22% is M&O. We thought that was very important because that helps explain when departments are asked to do cut proposals, the only real source where they can move that needle is in personnel. Are there any questions here, commissioners? Okay, now we're going to look at gross expenditures by department. And when I mean gross expenditures, you can see down at the bottom, I want to make sure that we all understand gross expenditures and what that means. Gross expenditures is the same as total expenditures. If you look at a department's budget and you go to look at their total expense, that also equates to gross expenditures. It also means total revenue distribution. If we were to take, for example, which is in effect what you do when you adopt the budget, and take the total revenue that comes into the general fund and distribute that to all the departments, it is the same thing as the total expenditures or the gross expenditures for each department. Very shortly, you're going to understand why we're making that distinction. If you have any questions here, as you can see, and you're going to hear from departments, and you'll get that opportunity to ask them detailed questions, you can see some departments, after the $9 million in cuts, still had increases. That is a lot related to those labor cost increases, labor cost agreements. The non-departmental, down at the bottom, I just want to draw your attention there. That is where we have those contingencies. So that we don't have personnel in there, that is just a non-departmental department. But that is where we house all of the pooled expenditures and pooled revenue that support all the departments. Here's why that was so important of understanding gross and total revenue distribution, because this portrayal here is a net budget or a tax distribution. This is what is important to the taxpayer. For example, we do have departments that do provide service, and I'll say the sheriff's office. We do provide policing services to Spokane Valley. But as a county taxpayer, where you want to know where your tax dollars go, this is what this represents. And by tax dollars, we're talking property tax and sales tax. So it's that larger pool, and then about 10% of that pooled revenue, which is you can see 113 million of pooled revenue, maybe about 10% is like interest or some of those other shared revenue sources. But more than 90% is the property tax and sales tax that gets distributed to all the other departments after they've had all of their service or other fees, fines, revenue that support their operations. Make sense? Okay. So from a taxpayer perspective, this is what is important, so the taxpayers understand where their taxing dollars are going into what services. Well, this came up backwards, but so when you put these pie charts next to each other and you see total expense or total revenue distribution by department compared to the tax distribution, you can see how some of those numbers change. Certainly under the total expense, the sheriff's office is the largest, has the largest total expense budget. But if you want to look at it and present it from a taxpayer perspective to see where their tax dollars are going, you can see a majority of their tax dollars are going towards our confinement services, our jail, and not really to the sheriff. And that is because the sheriff is really providing a lot of services to Spokane Valley.
And just a question on that. So what you're saying is you're taking out the contract amount in the tax distribution side of it.
Commissioner Cuny, that is correct. All other revenues are coming out, which does represent those service agreements or other revenue-supported services.
Thank you.
Okay, contingencies. Wanted to make sure that you understood what is included into the budget regarding these contingencies, some of which you've had in place before, but some are also new. General fund contingency. You've always had a general fund contingency because there are a lot of things that happen throughout the year that you just can't anticipate when you're establishing the budget. So for very good reason, you have a general fund contingency. Historically, it has been about $750,000. The budget office did some analysis, and we see on average, we've used about $400,000 a year of that contingency. Some years we've used more, some years we've used less, so this is just an annual average. It completely depends on the year. Personnel contingency. This is a new contingency. It's just sized based at 3% of payroll costs. That does not mean anything other than it's 3% of payroll costs, just to size it. We don't want to confuse anybody to say that that implies there's going to be a 3% COLA or anything of that sort. The decision for a COLA still resides with you. So what this personnel contingency would do would help to address such things as reclassifications, promotions, other employee costs, and benefits, for example. It could cover a wide variety of personnel costs. The example I'm going to give you is when I first came in May, one of the first reports the budget staff gave me was on reclassifications. Understandably, reclassifications and the impact from implementation of those changes month to month. But that first report I received, the total impact, and this was only as of May, for the fiscal year, was nearly $1 million. $500,000 of that was in the general fund. Now I look 2 months later and the number has changed. Again, because there are retirements, so positions, get filled with somebody at the bottom of the step range. And so those events do occur through the year. But that is in part why we wanted to have this in place. And we also understand that we're about ready to engage in more union negotiations, and we don't know how those are going to come out. We did have the outcome of 2 during 2017. So that's what that contingency is for. A strategic planning contingency. John has alluded to that there are several projects that the county is already currently engaged in. And you'll see if you review some of these suggestions where we will bring a plan forward for you It will take some seed money. To really make some changes, sometimes we do need to invest in equipment or software or a study, or we need a project manager to help transition to some of those new efficiencies. So that is a new one, and that's why those are green. And equipment replacement contingency. This is also a new contingency proposal. There is a significant equipment gap. I have heard from departments where they are still using, for example, vehicles that are nearly 30 years old, and it is most likely, we haven't done the analysis to prove it, but most likely costing us more to annually maintain and repair a vehicle of that age than what it would cost to purchase new and just amortize that new cost out. A capital contingency, $1 million. We're not proposing a change at this time in that amount. That's the same amount that you have in your 2017 budget. But it will continue to support those capital costs. The departments really did not focus on capital or equipment so much in 2018. They did put a lot of their energy into their operational side. But I can tell you what has been submitted, which may not be completely current, totaled more than $5 million and more than $20 million over the next 5 years. So you can see with just a $1 million contingency, we're not going to get very far in that list. What we would like to do is maintain that. And with all these contingencies, we will bring plans forward. We would ask your approval to use these contingencies. We can bring guidelines together of how they get used, what the approval process is, and we would certainly be reporting on the use of these contingencies so that you are a very active participant in these dollars and how they get used. Do you have any questions, commissioners?
So on the equipment, I'm assuming this is equipment that's outside of the ERR count. So we're not talking about vehicles, we're talking about other types of equipment then?
I don't know if we're talking about vehicles. We're not talking about vehicles that are utilized by the utilities or county road. I'm
Okay.
not quite sure about the other. But for instance, that's a great question, Commissioner. We had, correct me if I'm wrong, John, we had $10 million worth of requests. And we threw $1 million at, based on a matrix that we could discuss and we can change if we want. We've got a lot of capital needs. The kitchen in the jail, went, and it's still not done. I mean, half of it I think is done. And we're in that kind of thing that you and I are used to, all about the deferred maintenance that we went through across the street. And eventually, and I don't want to steal any thunder, we're also going to come up with a capital replacement plan for the general fund that will look familiar to the ER&R fund. That might be one of the values, because these things get out of hand and they get out of hand fast, and then when you go to fix them, it's devastating. So
Thank you.
Okay, now let's talk about fund balance. Sure. As of December 31st, 2016, the fund balance, undesignated, unassigned fund balance, was over $29 million. That is a very healthy fund balance, and the county should be extremely proud of itself for having such a strong fund balance. Certainly given its dependency on sales tax, which we saw in the portfolio was a good chunk of our portfolio, second largest revenue source, and ebbs and flows based on the economy. So we definitely want to be protected against that. At that time, it represented 17.7% of budgeted revenues. We had heard that there was some talk of what those reserves should be, and GFOA has suggested a reserve of at least 2 months of operating expenditures, which equates to 16.6%. GFOA, I mean, I love GFOA, and that stands for the Government Finance Officers Association, and I've been a longtime member of GFOA. We just need to constantly recognize, though, that when they do put out some of these recommendations, this is a national recommendation. And we really, it would probably be in the county's best interest to establish a reserve policy that meets our circumstance, what our revenue portfolio is, our debt, and whatever reserve requirements we already have established for our debt. In many cases, when debt is issued, reserves are required, depending on the structure of that debt. And just generally how we plan to use reserves and what kind of reserves we'd like to have. So what we're suggesting here, and I'll start at the bottom and move up, is that first we get your direction to establish a formal general fund reserve policy that is more descriptive of what are we going to reserve funds for what purpose or purposes, what level should those reserves be established, what's the criteria for using any of those reserves. For example, if you have a revenue stabilization reserve, well, how much would your revenue have to fluctuate before you say that you can use reserves? And also a policy would outline, okay, so what happens if you deviate from the reserve balance? How do you replenish it? Do you replenish it through establish a budget that starts to refill it over the course of 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, or 2 years?